She woke before the sun that morning when the sky was still the color of fading smoke, and the air tasted like rain that never came. She sat on the edge of her bed, her hands trembling around the mug of cold coffee. She never drank, and in that stillness, she felt the weight of 40 years resting on her chest, years that had passed in a blur of routine and noise and faces she no longer remembered. She had spent her life being what everyone needed her to be: a wife, a mother, a worker, a keeper of promises. But somewhere along the way she had stopped being herself. She could not remember the last time she had laughed without worrying who might hear, or danced without a reason, or breathed without counting what she owed to the world around her. The house was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator, and the faint ticking of the clock on the kitchen wall. She looked at that clock and felt something strange rise inside her, a quiet defiance maybe, or the first spark of courage she had not known in years. She stood up, walked to the mirror by the door, and stared at the woman staring back at her hair falling loose, her eyes tired, but still alive, still searching. She whispered something only she could hear, a promise, perhaps a goodbye, and in that whisper her voice cracked like the first break of dawn. Outside, the street was empty, the town still asleep, as if holding its breath. She stepped out with a small suitcase, the handle worn from years of neglect, her shoes pressed against the pavement that felt both familiar and foreign. She did not know exactly where she was going, only that she could not stay. She had built a life that looked complete from the outside, but inside it was hollow, filled with echoes of choices made for others and dreams stored away for someday that never came. She walked past the mailbox where she used to wait for letters that stopped coming long ago, past the corner store that once smelled of sugar and coffee, past the park where her son had taken his first steps, each place carrying a memory, a version of herself she had outgrown. The wind carried the sound of distant cars and faraway laughter, a world still moving forward. Without her, she felt the sting of that thought, but also the freedom that came with it, because for the first time she was not running toward anything, she was simply walking away. When she reached the edge of town, she paused and looked back. The roofs of houses shimmered under the faint light of morning, and for a moment she thought she saw her old self standing in one of those windows, waving silently. But she did not wave back. She turned her face to the road ahead, where the fields stretched wide and the horizon melted into sky. She began to walk again, each step slow and deliberate, her heart pounding in rhythm with her breath. She thought about the people she would leave behind, the questions they would ask, the stories they would tell about the woman who just disappeared. And she wondered if they would ever understand that leaving was not running away, it was returning to something she had lost long ago. The day began to unfold around her, the light softening the edges of everything, birds stirring in the trees, air warming with the promise of something new. She felt her body ache with exhaustion, yet her spirit trembled with something close to peace. She reached into her coat pocket and found an old photograph, crumpled and faded. It showed her standing on a beach years ago, smiling at nothing in particular, the ocean behind her endless and alive. She traced the outline of that younger woman with her thumb and whispered again, only this time it was not goodbye, it was hello. She walked until the road curved toward the highway, where cars moved fast and careless. She hesitated, unsure if she belonged among them. The world beyond that road was vast, full of strangers and chances, and everything she had never dared to imagine. She felt small and fragile, but also infinite in her smallness. She took a deep breath, felt the air fill her lungs, and stepped forward. As she crossed that invisible line between the life she knew and the one she was choosing, she felt something lift off her chest, something she had carried for decades, maybe regret, maybe fear, maybe both. The noise of the world grew louder, the smell of gasoline, the hum of engines, the rush of wind. But underneath it all there was a quiet voice whispering, keep going. And she did. She kept walking with the rhythm of someone who had nothing left to prove, and everything left to find. Her heart beat like a drum, echoing the truth. She had finally remembered that life begins again when you dare to let it. The road stretched before her like a river of forgotten dreams, winding through open fields and distant towns, and she walked with a kind of quiet that felt sacred. The air carried the scent of dust and wildflowers, and somewhere far away a train called out like a memory she could almost reach. She did not know where her feet were leading her, only that every step carried her further from the woman she once was, the woman who waited for permission to live. She stopped by a gas station on the edge of nowhere, the sign flickering, half alive. She went inside, the smell of old coffee and rain-soaked paper filling the air. The man behind the counter barely looked up, his radio whispering a love song that no one seemed to hear. She bought a bottle of water and a small pack of crackers, and when he handed her the change, he asked where you headed, and she almost laughed because she did not know. She said just going. He nodded like he understood, like he too had once felt the urge to leave before the walls closed in. She sat outside on the curb, the sun rising higher, painting the world in gold. The road shimmered, and the wind tugged at her hair. She closed her eyes, and for a moment, she could hear the echoes of her old life, the laughter of her child, the quiet voice of her husband, the endless lists of things to do, the expectations that built themselves into walls around her heart, and she felt both love and sorrow in the same breath, because she knew she had loved deeply, but she had forgotten how to love herself. When she opened her eyes, a woman was standing near the pump filling her car, a woman maybe a few years older with kind eyes and a tired smile. She looked at her and said, "You look like someone who's been walking a long way." She nodded, and the woman said, "I used to walk too." "I know that." Look, she offered her a ride, and for a moment she hesitated, because trusting a stranger felt like handing over the small freedom she had just begun to taste. But then she saw the sincerity in her eyes and said, "All right." The car smelled of mint and rain. The radio played softly, something slow and tender. The woman's name was Ruth. She had left her own town years ago with a story that sounded too familiar, a marriage that turned silent, dreams that got buried beneath laundry and routine. She talked about how she started over, how she worked at small cafes and slept in motels, and slowly learned that the world doesn't end when you walk away, it begins. And the woman listened, her heart opening like a window she didn't know she still had. She told Ruth little pieces of her own story, and Ruth nodded, not with pity, but with knowing. They drove until the sky began to change, until the fields turned into hills, and the wind grew cooler. Ruth said, "There's a small town up ahead near the coast, quiet place. People don't ask much. You could rest there a while." And she thought about it, the idea of stopping somewhere, not forever, just long enough to breathe. She agreed. And as they drove, she looked out at the passing trees, their branches waving like hands in farewell, or maybe in blessing. When they reached the town, it was late afternoon. The streets narrow, the houses small but alive with flowers in every window, children's laughter spilling out from yards, the ocean's distant roar blending with the hum of life. Ruth dropped her near a small inn and said, "This is where I started again. Maybe it can be that for you too." She handed her a small pendant, a simple silver leaf, and said, "Keep this as a reminder that no matter where you go, you're never too old to bloom." She watched Ruth drive away until her car disappeared beyond the bend. And then she turned toward the inn, a wooden sign swinging gently in the breeze. She stepped inside and was greeted by a man with kind eyes who said, "Welcome, stranger." And in that moment she felt something shift inside her, a small but certain sense that maybe the universe was not punishing her for leaving, maybe it was waiting for her to arrive. Her room was small, the walls painted a soft blue, the window opening toward the sea. She sat on the bed, the sound of waves folding into her heart. She had not realized how long it had been since she heard silence, not the silence of emptiness, but the silence that hums with life. She lay down, closed her eyes, and let the weight of years sink into the mattress. She dreamed of water endless and clear, washing away all that no longer belonged to her. When she woke, it was dark, the moonlight spilling across the floor. She stood and walked to the window, the ocean breathing steady like a living thing. She felt tears gather, not from sadness, but from something deeper, the recognition that she had made it, that she was still here, that she was beginning again, not as someone's mother or wife or neighbor, but as herself. And for the first time in decades she whispered her own name, and it sounded new. The morning came softly with the scent of salt and sunlight drifting through the open window. She lay there for a long time, listening to the slow rhythm of the sea, the cry of gulls, the murmur of life outside. She felt the gentle ache in her body that comes from long walking and longer years of holding everything in. She rose and looked at herself in the mirror again. But this time she did not search for the woman she had been. She simply looked at the face before her, bare and honest and alive. She dressed simply, a faded shirt, a long skirt she had packed without thinking, and she stepped outside, the air cool, the light painting gold over the cobblestones. People moved quietly. Here an old man sweeping his porch, a child chasing a red ball, a woman hanging laundry that fluttered like wings. She walked slowly, letting the world unfold around her. No one looked twice, no one asked where she came from, and that simple anonymity felt like grace. She found a small cafe by the corner, its door painted green, and its sign written by hand. She stepped inside, and the smell of coffee and bread wrapped around her like a warm blanket. A young woman behind the counter smiled and asked, "First time here?" She nodded and ordered whatever they had. Fresh, the young woman said, "Sit anywhere." And she took a seat by the window, watching the sea stretch beyond the rooftops. The food came simple, eggs, toast, fruit, but to her it tasted like something sacred. She had forgotten the taste of hunger that wasn't just for food. The young woman came again and asked if she was staying in town. She said maybe for a while. The woman smiled and said, "We can always use an extra pair of hands if you're looking for something to do." She thanked her and said she'd think about it. When she stepped back into the daylight, She felt something lift in her chest, the possibility of belonging without obligation, the idea that maybe this was a place she could heal. She wandered toward the beach, her shoes sinking into the sand, the wind tugging at her hair, the horizon endless. She walked along the water's edge, the waves washing her footprints away behind her. She thought of all the times she had tried to hold things that were meant to pass, how she had fought change, how she had stayed in rooms long after the warmth had left them. She sat on a piece of driftwood watching the waves move like breathing, and for the first time she let herself cry, not the quiet restrained tears she had hidden for years, but the deep trembling kind that carry everything out of you. The sea did not judge, it only listened. It carried her grief into its endless blue until she felt light again, hollowed but holy. When the sun began to fall, she walked back toward town, her hair damp, her eyes red, but her step steady. She passed by the same cafe and saw the young woman closing up. She waved, and the woman waved back, simple gestures that meant more than words. She returned to her room at the inn, lit a small lamp, and opened the window, the night air cool against her skin. She took out an old notebook she had carried in her bag, its pages blank, waiting. She began to write, not about the past, not about pain, just words that came without effort, fragments of feeling, glimpses of thought. She wrote until her hand ached and her eyes blurred, and when she looked at the page she saw herself there, raw, imperfect, alive. In the days that followed, she began helping at the cafe, washing dishes, carrying trays, sometimes sitting with the locals when they came in for coffee. They didn't ask much about her, and she didn't offer much, only that she had come from somewhere else and was learning how to breathe again. They accepted that as enough. She found joy in the smallness of her days, in the sound of laughter spilling from the kitchen, in the way the morning light touched the tables, in the soft hum of people living their ordinary lives. She began to laugh again, quietly at first, then freely, like the world wasn't watching. And in those moments she felt something new grow inside her, something gentle and strong. One evening the young woman from the cafe asked her to come to a gathering by the beach. The townsfolk played music and shared stories under the stars. She hesitated, but agreed. When she arrived, she saw a fire burning bright against the night, people dancing, children running barefoot, the smell of salt and smoke in the air. Someone handed her a cup of warm cider, and she took it, the sweetness lingering on her tongue. An older man began to play a violin, its sound trembling and beautiful, and as the notes rose and fell she closed her eyes and felt time melt away. No past, no future, just the present, humming like a heartbeat. She felt the warmth of the fire, the laughter around her, the vastness of the night, and for the first time she was not haunted by what she had lost. She was grateful for what she had found. When she walked back to the inn that night, the stars spilled like silver dust above her, and she whispered to the dark, "Thank you," not knowing exactly to whom, but knowing it was heard. She fell asleep with a quiet heart and dreams of light. The next morning arrived with a thin mist rolling in from the sea, soft and pale. It lingered over the rooftops and drifted into her open window. She woke to the sound of the waves whispering through the fog, her body heavy with the kind of rest that comes only after years of exhaustion. She sat up slowly, feeling the stillness settle around her like a friend she hadn't known she missed. She made a cup of tea and stood by the window watching the world blur gently in gray. The inn creaked with quiet life, the scent of old wood and salt and morning. She had started to love this silence, the kind that didn't demand anything from her, the kind that simply allowed her to exist. She thought of how strange it was that after 40 years of noise, of talking, of explaining herself to people who never really listened, she had found peace in saying nothing at all. Later that day she walked into town, the streets still damp from the fog, her boots leaving faint prints behind. She passed the small post office, a building no bigger than a living room, its door slightly open. She almost kept walking, but something drew her in. The air inside smelled of ink and paper and dust. An old man behind the counter looked up from his newspaper and said, "Morning." She nodded, smiled politely, and turned to leave, but he stopped her with a gentle voice, said, "You're the lady staying at the inn, right? Something came for you." Her breath caught off guard. She hesitated, and he handed her a small envelope worn at the edges, her name written in a familiar hand. The sight of it sent a rush of memories flooding through her. She thanked him quietly and stepped outside, the paper trembling between her fingers. She walked to the edge of town where the cliffs met the sea and sat on a stone wall, the wind tugging at her hair, the ocean churning below. For a long time she simply looked at the envelope, the weight of it heavier than it should have been. She hadn't told anyone where she was. She hadn't expected anyone to find her, yet here it was, a small piece of her past reaching across miles to touch her present. She opened it slowly, her heart pounding. Inside was a letter written in the handwriting she once knew better than her own. It was from her son. The words were simple but raw. He wrote that he had woken one morning to find her gone, that the house felt empty in a way he couldn't understand, that he wasn't angry, just confused. He said he missed her, that he wanted to know if she was safe, that he hoped she had found whatever it was she was looking for, and that maybe one day she could tell him why she had to leave. She read it again and again, her eyes stinging, her throat tight. She pressed the paper to her chest and let the wind take her tears. She had left to find herself, but in doing so she had left behind someone she loved more than anything. She felt the ache of that truth deep in her bones. But she also knew that this pain was part of the healing, that finding herself did not mean forgetting him. She folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope, then held it against her heart. As she watched the horizon stretch into forever, she whispered his name softly, letting it ride the wind across the sea. She promised the air that she would not stay hidden forever, that one day when she was ready she would return, not as the tired shadow he had known, but as a woman whole and alive. That evening she sat at her desk and wrote him back, her hand trembling over the page. She told him she was safe, that she was learning how to live again, that she loved him beyond words, and that sometimes loving someone meant stepping away so you could come back better. She didn't try to explain everything, because some things couldn't be explained, only lived. She sealed the envelope with a tear and a hope and dropped it at the post office before she could change her mind. As she walked back to the inn, the sun was setting, painting the sky in strokes of pink and gold. The waves glowed with light, and she felt something ease inside her, the understanding that healing was not about forgetting or escaping. It was about carrying the past with grace and choosing to keep walking. The days that followed felt softer, lighter. She worked at the cafe, laughed with the locals, and wrote each night by the lamplight. She began writing stories of women who found themselves after being lost, stories that felt both hers and not hers. She realized that in giving voice to their journeys, she was reclaiming her own. One afternoon, the young woman from the cafe found her sitting by the shore, notebook in hand, and asked what she was writing. She smiled and said, "Stories about beginnings." The young woman laughed and said, "You must have a lot to tell." She looked out at the water and replied, "More than I thought." And in that moment she understood that life did not start over at 40. It simply began to make sense, that leaving everything behind had not been the end, it had been the first breath of a new kind of living. It happened on an afternoon filled with sunlight that looked almost unreal, the kind of light that made everything shimmer, the sea, the glass, the quiet breath of the world. She had finished her shift at the cafe, her apron still tied loose around her waist. She was walking home through the narrow street when she saw a figure standing by the gate of the inn. At first it was only a shape against the light, a stillness that caught her mid-step. But then he turned and her heart stopped. It was her son. Older now, more man than boy, his shoulders broader, his eyes deeper. But she would have known him anywhere. The world seemed to fall silent except for the sound of her own heartbeat. She could not move for a moment, fear and joy and disbelief tangling inside her. He took a slow step forward, the way a person approaches a memory, unsure if it will fade when touched. And then he said softly, "Mom." The word hit her like wind. She felt it in her bones, all the years, all the silence, all the distance collapsing in an instant. She walked toward him, her breath uneven, her eyes burning. And when she reached him, she stopped inches away, afraid that if she spoke she might break. He didn't wait. He reached out and pulled her close, his arms tight around her, his voice muffled against her shoulder, saying, "It's really you." She held him as if the world depended on it, her fingers clutching his back, her tears soaking into his shirt. She wanted to speak, but there were no words, only the sound of two hearts finding each other again. She pulled back just enough to look at him, his face familiar, yet new, and she said, "You came." He nodded and said, "I had to." They sat on the bench by the inn, the same one she had watched the sea from so many times. The air smelled of salt and sunlight. He told her he had found the letter she sent, how he had read it again and again, how something in her words had made him understand that she hadn't left him. She had left the life that was killing her. He said, "I was angry at first, but then I realized you were teaching me something about courage, even if you didn't mean to." She listened, her hands trembling in her lap, and said, "I never wanted to hurt you, I just didn't know how to stay and still be me." He nodded, his eyes soft, and said, "I know now. I think sometimes you have to lose the map to remember where you're going." They walked to the beach, the tide low, the sand cool beneath their feet. They talked for hours, not about everything, just enough about the small things that make people real, what he was doing, where she had been, what they both had learned about love and distance and forgiveness. When the sun began to fall, they stood in silence, watching it sink into the horizon. She whispered, "Thank you for finding me." He smiled and said, "I didn't find you, Mom. You finally let yourself be seen." That night they had dinner at the cafe, candles flickering, soft music in the background. The locals smiled, curious, but kind. They looked like two travelers who had come home from different directions yet met in the same place. She felt peace in a way she never had before, not the peace of escape, but the peace of acceptance. After he left to rest in a room upstairs, she sat alone by the window, her heart full. She thought of how far she had come from the woman who walked away with nothing but a suitcase and a trembling heart. She realized that leaving had not been about running, it had been about returning to herself, and now that she had done that, she could love him better, freer. In the morning they walked through the market together. He laughed at how everyone greeted her, how she had become part of this small town. She showed him the cafe, the paths by the sea, the place. She wrote her stories. He watched her with a kind of quiet awe, and said, "You look alive, Mom." She smiled, and said, "I am." Before he left they stood by the bus stop, the ocean behind them, the air heavy with unspoken words. He held her hands, and said, "I'm proud of you." She felt tears rise, but she didn't hide them. She said, "I'm proud of me too." And they laughed through their tears like two people who finally understood that love doesn't end when you let go, it grows. He boarded the bus, turned once and waved. She watched until he disappeared beyond the curve of the road. And then she turned back toward the sea, the world around her glowing with late morning light. She walked slowly, breathing deeply, the kind of breath that reaches the soul. She knew he would go back to his life, and she would stay here, but neither of them would ever be the same. As she stood there, the waves lapping at the shore, she whispered to the horizon, "Not goodbye, but thank you for the strength to leave, thank you for the courage to stay gone, thank you for the grace to begin again." The wind carried her words out to sea, and somewhere deep inside, she felt them return as peace. Days passed like pages turning in a quiet book, the rhythm of her life steady like the tide. Each morning, she rose before the sun, her bare feet finding the cool floor, her body light, her heart still learning how to trust peace. She would stand by the window and watch the first colors break across the sky, and in that gentle silence, she always felt gratitude, a soft ache of knowing that she was still here, that she had rebuilt something sacred from the pieces she once thought were lost forever. The cafe became her heartbeat. She began baking in the mornings, learning from the old woman who ran the kitchen, a woman named June who hummed old songs while she kneaded dough. June said the secret to good bread was patience and warmth, two things she realized she was finally learning to give herself. She would watch the loaves rise in the oven and think about how people are not so different, how time and heat and stillness shape us too. Word began to spread about the woman who had come from somewhere far away and now wrote stories at the corner table by the window. Sometimes travelers would stop and ask about her stories, and she would smile shyly and say, "They're not mine really, they belong to everyone who's ever had to start over." She began reading them aloud on quiet evenings when the cafe closed and the candles burned low. People would stay and listen, the sound of the sea outside mingling with her voice, her words soft but full of truth. She told stories of loss and finding, of leaving and returning, of the courage to become someone new, and though the stories came from her heart, they seemed to belong to everyone in the room. One night, after she finished, a young woman came up to her, eyes shining, and said, "Your words made me remember that it's not too late," and she felt something inside her unfold like a flower opening to light. She realized then that her pain had become a bridge, that her journey was not just for her, it was for anyone who needed to believe that healing was possible. The cafe owner June noticed the change in her, the way her laughter came easier, the way her eyes sparkled, even on quiet days. June said, "You found your way back, didn't you?" She nodded and said, "Maybe I just stopped running away." June smiled and said, "Same thing really." One afternoon she was invited to speak at the small library by the pier. They wanted her to read one of her stories. She hesitated at first, fear whispering that she was not meant to stand in front of people. But she went anyway. The room was small, the chairs mismatched, the windows open to the sea breeze. She stood there, her hands trembling, her heart beating fast. And when she began to read, her voice shook. But it was real. She spoke of change, of loss, of the moment you realize that staying small will not save you. She told them that leaving her life at 40 had not been an ending, it had been an awakening. When she finished, the room was silent for a moment, and then the sound of hands clapping rose soft and full of warmth. She looked up and saw tears in the eyes of strangers, and she knew then that her story had found its purpose, not to glorify pain, but to remind others that life keeps offering itself to us no matter how many times we turn away. After the reading, a man came to her with gray hair and kind eyes. He said, "My wife passed last year. I didn't think I'd ever feel alive again. But hearing you tonight made me believe that maybe I can start over too." She placed her hand on his and said, "Maybe we both already have." That night she walked home under a sky full of stars, the air cool and gentle, the world humming with quiet magic. She thought about all the people who carried silent stories inside them, stories they were too afraid to tell. and she wished she could gather them all, hold them close, and say it's okay, you can begin again right where you are. When she reached her room, she lit a small candle, and sat by the window, her notebook open. She began writing a new story, this one different. It was not about leaving, but about becoming, about how sometimes the greatest journey is the one that leads you back to yourself. She wrote until the candle burned low, her words flowing like the tide, each one a small prayer. And as the first light of dawn touched the sky, she looked out at the ocean that had become her witness, her teacher, her friend. She smiled softly and whispered, I made it. The seasons began to move quietly through the little town, the air shifting from salt to rain to the gentle chill of early winter. She felt it in her bones, the rhythm of change, the quiet growth that no one sees. She had lived here for more than a year now, though it felt both longer and shorter. As if time had softened around her, she no longer counted days or measured worth in hours. She simply lived, breathed, worked, wrote, and let the world unfold. Her stories began to travel before she did. Someone from the city had visited the cafe one evening, a journalist who listened to her, read, and later asked if he could share her words. She hesitated, afraid of being seen, too much afraid the world might take what she had rebuilt and twist it. But June told her gently, the world needs voices that sound like truth, so she said yes. Weeks later, a small article appeared online about the woman who changed her life at 40. It told of the sea town, the cafe, the stories, the healing people. Read it, and something about it stirred them. Letters began to arrive at the cafe, at the inn, from strangers across the country, people writing that her words had reached them in hospital rooms, in quiet apartments, in cars parked by highways where they too were deciding whether to leave or stay. She read every letter, sometimes with tears, sometimes with laughter, sometimes with both. One morning a package came wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a book, one of her stories, printed by a small press with her name on the cover. She stared at it for a long time, tracing the letters, as if they belonged to someone else. She had never imagined her voice could live beyond her. She walked down to the beach, holding the book close, feeling the wind brush against her face. She whispered to the waves, look at that, I did it without even trying. Soon people began to visit the town because of her, not in crowds, just one or two at a time. Women, mostly, some her age, some younger, some older. They would come into the cafe shy at first, order coffee, then ask, are you the one from the story? And she would smile and say maybe. They would talk quietly, sharing their lives, their fears, their hopes. And when they left, she always felt lighter, because every story shared was a weight lifted from the air. She started hosting small gatherings on Sundays by the sea, not to teach, not to preach, just to sit in a circle of strangers and speak about life, about change, about what it means to start over. They brought notebooks and candles, sometimes flowers, sometimes just themselves. And as the sun dipped low, they spoke until the stars appeared. And in those moments she realized that healing had become contagious, that courage passed from one person to another like light through glass. One night after the circle ended, she walked home alone, the moon bright above her. She thought about the woman she had been the morning she left everything behind, the trembling, the fear, the not knowing. She thought of how far she had walked, how many times she had wanted to turn back, and how every time she didn't, a door opened somewhere unseen. She understood now that courage isn't loud, it's the quiet decision to take one more step even when the map is gone. Inside her room she stood before the mirror again, the same mirror that once reflected a stranger, now showing a woman who knew herself, her eyes clear, her hair streaked with silver, her skin lined with life. She whispered softly, I'm still here. And it sounded like a promise. Letters continued to arrive, one from her son saying he had been offered a job by the coast that he might visit soon. She smiled, knowing that this time she wouldn't be found because she wasn't lost anymore. She imagined him standing by the sea, breathing the same air, knowing that somewhere close his mother had rebuilt her soul. The cafe remained her sanctuary. She still rose early, still kneaded dough with June, still laughed with the locals. Sometimes she caught herself watching newcomers arriving at the inn carrying their own invisible suitcases full of grief and hope, and she would smile quietly, knowing what it meant to start again. On the anniversary of the day she left her old life, she returned to the cliff where she had first opened her son's letter. The wind was strong, the sea restless. She stood there with her eyes closed, letting the past and the present merge like waves meeting shore. She whispered to the wind, thank you for breaking me open, thank you for teaching me that sometimes falling apart is how you begin again. When she opened her eyes, she felt a peace so deep it almost hurt. The horizon stretched endless, the future vast and unwritten. She turned and walked back toward town, her steps sure, her heart steady, her story still unfolding. Years slipped by the way waves fade and return, never truly leaving, just reshaping what they touched. The town grew a little busier, new faces came and went, new stories began and ended. But she remained, not out of fear of change, but because she had become part of this place, like the scent of coffee in the morning, or the sound of gulls calling at dusk. She was no longer a visitor. She was the pulse of the quiet life she had built. Her hair had turned silver, now soft against her shoulders, her eyes still bright, still curious. She moved slower, but with a calm that made others follow her pace. The cafe was still there now, run by June's daughter, who had kept the old recipes but added her own sweetness. The walls were covered with photographs from years gone, by one of her younger self holding the first copy of her book, one of the Sunday circles by the sea, one of the lighthouse glowing behind her in the rain. She rarely looked at them. She preferred the living moments unfolding before her, the smell of bread, the laughter of strangers, the hush before sunrise. Sometimes she walked to the beach at dawn, watching the horizon where the sea met the sky. She would whisper good morning as if greeting an old friend. She often saw travelers standing where she once stood, looking out at the water, clutching bags, eyes full of questions. Sometimes they would notice her and ask, "Do you live here?" She would nod, and they would ask softly, "Is it hard to start over?" She always smiled and said, "Only until it isn't." Her words traveled farther than she ever had. One of her stories found its way into a documentary. Another was read at a graduation. A young woman once wrote to her saying that hearing her voice saved her from giving up. She read that letter aloud at the cafe that evening, her hands trembling a little, everyone listening in silence. She said softly, "I didn't save anyone, I just told the truth, and the truth did the rest." Her son visited one summer, taller than she remembered, older, but still carrying the same light. They walked by the water for hours, no apologies, no explanations, just shared air, shared footsteps, shared peace. He told her he had a daughter now, and that he named her Hope. She laughed and cried all at once, the kind of tears that taste like gratitude. When they parted, he hugged her tight and said, "You did it, Mom, you really did it." She smiled and said, "We both did." That night she sat by her window, the sea breathing below her, and she thought about all the women who had written to her, all the voices that had joined hers across miles and years. She realized she had never truly been alone, that even in the beginning when she felt invisible, she had been walking toward this moment, the quiet knowing that leaving behind isn't losing, it's returning to who you were meant to be. As the moon rose over the sea, she closed her eyes and listened to the world, the waves, the wind, the heartbeat of a life rebuilt. She felt no regret, no fear, no rush, only gratitude. She whispered thank you to the universe, to the journey, to the woman she had once been, for daring to walk away, and for never looking back. When morning came, the town woke slowly, the cafe opened, the sea shimmered gold, and somewhere a new traveler stepped off a bus carrying her own quiet hope. And though the woman was gone, her story remained in the air, in the water, in the hearts of those who had heard her name, the legend of the woman who changed her life at 40. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe for more this type of powerful stories.